Oh, that's so much better. Hey everyone, I'm Ben, your underground conductor, and welcome to Underground Cinema. Now in this video, I'll be continuing my Pride Month series by talking about a very important film that was nearly lost to the ages. Not only that, but it's also a film that I did not realize existed until relatively recently. The film in question being Anders als die anderen, otherwise known as Different from the Others. Now, as mentioned, this film is incredibly important, and the reason it is incredibly important is because Different from the Others is the earliest known feature-length gay movie. As I've mentioned before, queer cinema is nearly as old as cinema itself, and there were certainly examples of queer themes and subject matter played around with in films before this. Some examples would include the Dickinson experimental sound film from 1894, and there was also a few films that were made by Charlie Chaplin where he cross-dressed as a woman. But in terms of actually covering the topic of homosexuality in depth, Different from the Others is the first known film to do it. The film itself began production during the tail end of World War I, at a point in Germany when there was no real film regulation or censorship in place, and the purpose of the film, as set out by the writer-director Richard Oswald, as well as the co-writer and sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld, was to educate the public about the topic of homosexuality. Not only that, but Different from the Others also became the first film in a series of quote-unquote Enlightenment films that covered various moral and sexual topics that inherently challenged the prevailing philosophies and moral customs of the age. Now, like I've referenced before, I'm a big fan of German movies, which is why it was really remarkable to me that I hadn't heard about this film until relatively recently. Of course, doing research into it, it became incredibly clear why I'd never heard of it. Obviously, with my channel, my intention is always to cover lesser-known films, and Different from the Others fills that niche to a T, as, unsurprisingly, within a year of the film's release, it faced so much controversy that it was actually banned from public screenings. And following that, when the Nazi Party took power in the 1930s, they destroyed every single copy of the film that they could find. Following the film's destruction, the only known version of the film to still exist was a shortened version that was made available in the documentary Laws of Love that was actually made by the film's co-writer Magnus Hirschfeld. Decades later, a copy of this documentary ended up being discovered in Russia, and after this discovery, film restorationists quickly worked to attempt to reconstruct Different from the Others, and unfortunately, unlike Metropolis, which actually has most of its footage available, Different from the Others was not as fortunate, as they had to basically Frankenstein the film back together using the footage that they found from the documentary, as well as still images from various institutes and museums, and filling in the gaps in the plot using film journals, film essays, and German censorship cards. So suffice to say, the version of the film that exists today is obviously incredibly different from the original version. That being said, the footage that survives from this film shows exactly how miraculous it is that a movie like this would come out in this era over 100 years ago. And what makes the film so miraculous isn't just the subject matter that it covers, but how it conveys those subjects in a surprisingly progressive manner. So with that in mind, what exactly happens in Different from the Others? Well, when the film opens up, we come to meet our main character, a concert violinist named Paul Körner, played by actor Conrad Veidt. Now, Conrad Veidt was an absolute icon of the German silent era, starring in such films as The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and The Man Who Laughs, which is actually a film that I have reviewed. However, Conrad Veidt was also able to carve out a career for himself during the sound era, starring in several talkies, including Casablanca, where he plays the Nazi officer Major Strausser. The man was an absolutely spectacular actor, and he also had a spectacular life that I would recommend looking into. And I'll talk more about him later in the video, but suffice to say, Veidt starring in this film offers the film a certain level of gravitas, and also helps to elevate this movie beyond a status that it already holds. A status that would have already been afforded to it based on its subject matter, but Veidt really just works to kick this film up another level. Anyway, when we're introduced to the character of Paul Körner, we see that he's reading obituaries in the newspaper, and all the obituaries that he's reading show various men who have recently committed suicide for some mysterious reason. Of course, Paul Körner knows exactly what this reason is. The reason all these men have committed suicide is because they're all victims of paragraph 175, which was a real German law that was in place at the time, which outlawed homosexuality and made it a criminal act punishable by up to 5 years in prison. But in addition to the prison sentences, once you were convicted under this law, you were socially ostracized. and oftentimes many people who were outed as gay would commit suicide as an escape from this discriminatory society. Paul likens paragraph 175 to the sword of Damocles just hanging over every gay man's head. And obviously he's perturbed by the news, but unfortunately it's just an everyday reality that he lives with. Following this scene, though, we then pivot to one of Paul Körner's violin concerts. And at the concert, we are introduced to the main love interest of this film, a young man named Kurt Sivers, who apparently shows up to all of Paul Körner's concerts. And apparently this concert in particular really spoke to him because immediately after the concert, he goes to visit Paul Körner at his estate, and Kurt goes on to beg Paul to take him on as a violin student. Paul agrees, and the two men end up forming a close bond with each other. But this bond ultimately worries Kurt's parents, not because they think he's gay, but because they're worried that he's wasting his life with music when he should be doing something more practical. At the same time, however, Paul's parents also grow concerned because they've noticed that he's gotten to a certain age and has yet to take on a wife and start a family. They try to hook Paul up with a wealthy young widow, but it doesn't really work out, and then they come to the discovery that their son is gay. Now, as all this interpersonal conflict ensues, the antagonist enters the narrative. Franz, a local blackmailer, who actually recognizes Paul while he's walking with Kurt in a local park. And following this meeting, Franz actually goes to see Paul at his house to blackmail him. Because, as mentioned, being a homosexual at the time was illegal, and it was very common in real life for people to blackmail known homosexuals, otherwise they would report them. Paul plays along with the blackmail for a while, but eventually he puts his foot down and refuses to pay any more. And following this cutoff, Franz resolves to get his money another way, as he chooses to break into Paul's house while Paul and Kurt are performing at a concert. And it's actually Kurt's first time performing at a public concert, which is pretty amazing for him. Of course, this amazing night for Kurt is undermined by the discovery that his mentor, Paul, is being robbed by this blackmailer. Paul and Kurt end up fighting with Franz, and they're eventually able to overpower him, but Franz brings up a point to Kurt that Kurt is not any different from him because Kurt also collects money from Paul. Because, obviously, Kurt is Paul's student, and he just did a concert with Paul. This comment really gets to Kurt, and as a result he chooses to leave Paul, leave his family, and try to make something of himself on his own. And following Kurt's departure, we see that Paul really has nothing else to do aside from reflecting on his past, and recalling the various tragedies that he's had to overcome throughout his life, like when he was expelled from boarding school because he was caught with a boy, or when he was bullied in college by other boys for not being normal, and how eventually as an adult he went on to try to cure his perceived illness, being his homosexuality. That is until eventually he realized that his homosexuality was not an illness, but just part of who he was, and how he eventually chose to embrace it. Of course, as we come to see, the first person that he tries to embrace his homosexuality with was the blackmailer, Franz. And upon thinking about this, Paul has finally gotten fed up and decides to report Franz for blackmail. Of course, simultaneously, Franz reports Paul for being a homosexual, and as a result, the two men both stand trial for their crimes. Things aren't necessarily looking good for Paul, but fortunately, his doctor, played by Magnus Hirschfeld, comes to give a statement to the court about homosexuality. And this statement evidently had a very significant influence on the trial. As we see at the end of the trial, Franz gets convicted of the crime of blackmail and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Meanwhile, Paul is shown leniency by the court. While it is true that unfortunately paragraph 175 is still in effect at this point, he is only given a 1-week prison sentence in recognition of not only his doctor's testimony, but the struggles he's had to deal with as a person. However, despite this light sentence, Paul's life at this point is essentially over. As news of his conviction has traveled around, he gets socially ostracized by his friends, by his family, and his agency goes on to cancel his contract as well as his violin tour. At this point, Paul's character has nothing else to face aside from anguish and despair. And feeling the weight of the sword of Damocles crashing down on him, he chooses to end his own life. Upon the news of Paul's death, Kurt rushes to the funeral, weeps over Paul's body, and attempts to kill himself to be with Paul. He's gonna Romeo and Juliet that shit. However, at the last moment, Kurt is restrained by Paul's doctor, Magnus Hirschfeld, who tells him that he should not kill himself, but instead should work to live his life to change the culture that ultimately killed his friend and mentor. And that's exactly what Kurt does, as we find out at the end of the film that eventually paragraph 175 has been repealed. But unfortunately, despite this moral victory, nothing can bring Paul back, as he was just the final victim of this terrible law. And yeah, that's how the film ends. Now, I'll be very frank about this. This is a movie that is basically impossible to review properly based on the version of it that exists. Like I mentioned before, the version available today is a reconstruction, and most of the footage is not available, which is evident based on the fact that the reconstruction is only 50 minutes long. So, as a result, there's certain aspects of this movie that I simply cannot opine to, such as the emotional impact of the ending. You see, even though Paul's death is tragic and incredibly well acted by Conrad Veidt, it doesn't carry the emotional impact that it feels like it should, because most of the footage leading to the build-up is not available. And of course, none of this is the film's fault. It's the fault of the Nazi Party who tried to destroy the movie, but it is unfortunately the case that the film doesn't carry the impact that it should. Not only that, but there's also various plot elements of the story that cannot be appraised properly. For example, one of the major subplots in this movie is that apparently Kurt's sister, Else, has also fallen in love with Paul, and she's growing increasingly frustrated over the fact that he is not attracted to her. And there's virtually no footage of this subplot or even Else's character available in the film. The most we get is a couple still images, so this makes appraising the film as an overall product basically impossible. So with that all in mind, I'm going to do my best to avoid discussing this film as an overall product, and instead try to evaluate the elements of the film that actually have footage to look at. And obviously I can't really do a perfect job at this, considering that so many of the gaps in the narrative are just filled in with title cards. But I'll try to talk about things that I think work and things that I think don't work. For example, a positive aspect of this film that I think is plainly observable is the quality of the performances. From what you can see in this film, all the actors are incredibly expressive, which is to be expected considering that many actors from the silent film era came directly from theater, so they were used to being more expressive with their bodies, since the audience would be a distance away from them. But in addition to that, obviously since this was pre-sound, actors had to be more expressive because they couldn't rely on dialogue to carry the film. However, a notable exception to this expressiveness is actually Conrad Veidt, as Veidt's performance at times is both expressive and subtle. Since he is the star of the movie, he gets a fair amount of close-ups, which works to show the expressiveness that he is able to convey with his face. And there's also several instances of this film where you can see subtle movements that communicate how his character is feeling in the moment. Like when we first see him get blackmailed in the film by the character of Franz. He hands Franz the money without looking at him, and then he slowly turns his head back in irritation of the fact that he has to live his life like this. There's also the scene directly preceding Paul's suicide, as he just slowly descends into his chair, tired and fed up. All of these actions work perfectly to illustrate the mood of Paul's character, and Veidt does not miss a beat. The man was just an amazing actor. I wish I could comment more on other performances in this film, like the performance of Fritz Schultz, who plays Kurt in this film, but unfortunately there's simply not enough reference footage available to talk about Fritz's performance. Something I can talk about, though, is his character as well as the character of Paul, as the dynamic between the two of them is incredibly interesting. I mean, the basic plot of this movie is that you have a mentor fall in love with his student, and that is inherently an imbalanced power dynamic existing in their relationship. However, despite this imbalance in their power dynamic, based on the footage we see, they seem to be on pretty equal footing. Paul is obviously the older one and is supposed to be the more responsible one, but based on what we can see in this film, he overtly doesn't take advantage of the situation at all. Based on the reference footage, it simply appears that what happens is that Kurt goes to see Paul to become his student, and then feelings slowly develop between the two over time. It's not one of those cases where a mentor or teacher asked for sexual favors in exchange for career advancement. Instead, Paul treats this budding romance between him and his student with a certain level of respect and maintains a certain level of professionalism. Meanwhile, Kurt's character acts in a very similar manner, as it's clear, despite the fact that he is developing feelings for Paul, he also prioritizes learning the violin. And as a side note, I think it's pretty interesting the fact that Kurt's parents in this film actively discourage his desire to go into music. It's an oddly timeless story that's also relevant in the real world, the fact that so many families will discourage young artists, particularly musicians, because they're worried that what they're going into isn't pragmatic. You see this in so many different things. I think probably one of the best examples is in the animated movie The Book of Life. There's also the Pixar knockoff of The Book of Life, Coco, which covers the exact same subject. But regardless, I think it's a very interesting trope that's employed in this film, and I also think that it extends to the aspect of pride present in German culture, particularly amongst German men. The idea that Kurt's father doesn't want his son to be a musician, because he's probably a proud German man. And that aspect of German pride also reflects on to Kurt as he becomes insecure in this film regarding his subordinate position to Paul. Like I mentioned, Kurt chooses to leave Paul and his family upon the realization that he hasn't really made anything of himself on his own. He's not his own man. So after he gets accused by Franz the blackmailer of being financially dependent on Paul, he chooses to change that. He chooses to leave both his family and the man that he loves because he doesn't feel like a man himself, which is an incredibly interesting aspect of the film, which I wish had footage to reference. That being said, moving on from Kurt, I also want to get into the character of Franz the blackmailer, as I find his character incredibly interesting, and aspects of how he's represented to be incredibly nuanced and interpretable. So like I mentioned, the first man that Paul ever took home was Franz, the blackmailer. But before they even get the chance to kiss, Franz demands money from Kurt, and we never actually get to see them kiss in the movie. And what I find interesting about this is that it creates ambiguity and makes me question, okay, is Franz the blackmailer a gay man who takes advantage of other gay men? Or is he a straight man who lures in gay men to blackmail them? It's an incredibly interesting aspect of the narrative that doesn't really have a clear answer, and that could be a consequence of the fact that a lot of the footage in this film is not available. But regardless, I find it interesting. And this idea that he could be a gay man himself is sort of reinforced as one of the surviving scenes in this film shows him sitting in a gay bar. So I just really find it interesting that this early film not only has a nuanced positive take with a queer protagonist, but also has a nuanced negative take of a queer antagonist. It simultaneously conveys the positive aspects of a queer relationship, but also shows how other forces in life, potentially from other queer people, could ruin that. And the fact that Franz's character exists like this feels like a really interesting early example of internalized homophobia. Or maybe he's just a douchebag taking advantage of an easy situation. However, while we're on the topic of queer representation in this film, I do feel like it's important to bring up some of the aspects that aren't that great. Now, to be clear, most of this film has aged phenomenally well. Obviously, this film depicts a positive and surprisingly healthy queer relationship between two men, which is just remarkable considering that this came out in 1919. But the film also goes out of its way to reiterate the idea that homosexuality is just a healthy and normal biological practice, which is, like, I cannot stress how mind-boggling that position is in this film, considering that it came out over 100 years ago. But one of the more dour aspects of this film is the tragic ending, unfortunately, as Paul's character chooses to take his own life as a result of being socially shunned by everyone. Now, despite the fact that this ending doesn't really carry the emotional impact that it should, due to the lack of footage available, I always have an inherent respect for a film that chooses to kill off its central character, as I genuinely consider it to be a bold narrative decision. However, it should be mentioned that many other queer films have the exact same ending, where the main character dies. I'm not going to name any specific examples because I don't want to spoil any of these films, but it is often the case in queer films that the main character does in fact die, and they often die either as a result of social forces or as a result of their own hedonism. And unfortunately, it's not any different with this film. This is an incredibly common trope in queer cinema and has been widely criticized by the LGBT community as it reinforces the idea that queer people are constantly victims of either society or themselves. However, that being said, considering that this literally was the first gay movie, I can give it a pass for having the main character die. I can give it a pass for that. What I cannot give a pass for, however, is the lecture scene in this movie. As mentioned, the sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld not only co-wrote this movie, but has a supporting role in the film. And there's an extended scene in the movie where he's giving a lecture on human sexuality, and specifically homosexuality. And I'll give credit where credit's due. This lecture scene is not only incredibly impressive, but also incredibly progressive as Hirschfeld goes on to explain that homosexuality is a perfectly normal and healthy variation that exists commonly in nature, and how both non-traditional gender expression as well as homosexuality can be correlated but can also vary independently. And we also see that during the lecture, he shows several different pictures of cross-dressers, homosexuals, and transgender people, as he goes on to elaborate that the behavior of these individuals is brought on by biological influence. Which, once again, this movie came out over 100 years ago, and almost everything that this sexologist says in the movie is more or less consistent with mainstream science today explaining sexual habits of human beings. It's truly remarkable. However, despite how much I admire the lecture scene's inclusion in this movie, it also feels like it's kind of dropped in the narrative, and it draws a lot of attention away from the central plot of the relationship between Paul and Kurt, and their separation as a result of blackmail. Like, the focus of the film is overtly on the struggles that homosexuals have to face in everyday life during this era. And while the lecture scene technically ties into the central theme, it also takes away from the main narrative so much, and really just comes off as a preachy PSA. It's kinda weird and awkward. And it also feels like so many of the ideas that Hirschfeld expresses during the lecture scene could have been reserved for various other scenes throughout the film where people were questioning homosexuality. And one of the surviving pieces of footage is actually a scene where this happens. It's during the flashback sequence that Paul's character is having about his life, and we see that the thing that eventually pushed Paul into embracing his homosexuality was a visit that he paid to Magnus Hirschfeld. And during this scene, Hirschfeld expresses similar ideas of how love within one's own sex can be as pure as love from the opposite sex. And who knows, it is the case that a lot of the scenes with Hirschfeld's character are not available to view, so it's very possible that all these ideas were communicated in the various scenes featuring his character, but if they were, then it begs the question, why include the lecture scene? Like, seriously, it just feels like it takes away from the overall narrative of the film. And also, as I found out while I was doing research, not only did Hirschfeld co-write this movie, but he also co-financed it through his Sexual Studies Institute. So, taking that into consideration, it kind of feels like the lecture scene is basically advertising for Hirschfeld. It just feels really odd. Still, putting that aside, I think Different from the Others is an incredibly intriguing film. Obviously, since all the footage is not available, the film can't really be properly enjoyed in the way it was originally intended to be seen. But regardless of that, I think watching this film is incredibly intriguing on an intellectual level, and also on a narrative level, seeing how these themes were tackled over a century ago. And the fact that homosexuality in this film is not only portrayed positively, but is defended on both moral and scientific grounds, is astonishing enough to warrant a viewing of this film. So ultimately, I would recommend going out to see Different from the Others. And like I keep saying, this movie's over 100 years old. It is very widely available. In fact, I think I stumbled across 4 copies of the film just on YouTube. And I'm sure there's many more that I didn't even see. But definitely go and check it out, and who knows, maybe one day, if we're lucky, they will discover a full copy of the original film, and we'll actually be able to see it as intended. But anyway, that was my review of Different from the Others. I hope you all enjoyed it. Please feel free to subscribe if you're feeling generous. You can also follow me on Instagram or Letterboxd if you want to hear more of my film takes. And I will see you later. I feel so restricted. Let me get out of this. Woo! So much better. For those of you who thought I would ever cut my hair. Really? Really? Seriously? Nah.